Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arts and Minds in the midst of winter, loss of life, and grief. If you would like to join the conversation, please feel free to either type your comments in or you can email directly to Amanda H at urbanmediaarts.org. The email is on the bottom of the screen, and you can possibly be one of the people who's featured on the show. Thanks, and we'll be with you soon.
deschiuso il firmamento, al Signor lo spirito anello, e Maria decento e cento, gaudete mio me desiglio, o splendor degli ostri addio, me di luce il radio Dio. Già dal frai che guide in piombo fugge l'alma, e vola al ciel, fugge l'alma, vola al ciel, e vola al ciel, fugge l'alma, vola al ciel, e vola al ciel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Rubin. I've lived in Malden for 10 years, and I'm the author of 2 historical novels. The first is based on a 17th century English folk ballad, and the second tells of the romance between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, primarily based on the Ethiopian tradition. In 2019, they were combined into a single volume called Ancient Tales Newly Told. I guess I have an interest in old stories because my pandemic project has been focused on the genre of classic fairy tales, which I hope to publish by the end of this year as a book with the working title of Villainy Ever After. And so tonight I want to address the topic of mortality in fairy tales. A sense of mortality, the threat of death, hangs over every fairy tale. The core of almost every fairy tale is for some vulnerable person, often a child, to overcome powerful forces threatening their life. There's Snow White and the Poisoned Apple, Hansel and Gretel and the Cannibalistic Witch, Little Red Riding Hood and the Hungry Wolf, Sleeping Beauty and the Evil Fairy, the Children of Hamelin and the Pied Piper's Magical Flute, Jack and the Giant who lives above the beanstalk. Yet fairy tales almost always have happy endings. The witches and evil stepmothers and wolves and giants get their comeuppance, and the heroes not only survive, they live happily ever after. But what happens when we turn fairy tales around and tell them from the perspective of the villains? I belong to a writers group here in Malden, and one of our writing prompts last year was to do just that. I found it a very fun exercise, and over the course of the lockdown, I wrote 12 more. You see, when you tell a fairy tale from the perspective of the villain, it ends not happily, but tragically. You see the suffering of the villain. In fact, you linger in it. The supposed hero is long gone, and we're left with a creature who is beaten and broken, dying or dead. Suddenly, the villain isn't quite as fearsome as in the original version. Tell the story from their point of view, and they become almost sympathetic. I didn't intend to make my stories that way, but that's how many of them ended up. As I said at the beginning, mortality is woven into the fabric of every fairy tale, and never more so than when you flip the script. I will now read that first fairy tale that I retold in this way. It's based on Little Red Riding Hood. My version is titled Little Red Pool of Blood. The first person narrator is the wolf. This forest has been my home for 6 years. I know its paths well. I know where sunlight breaks through the forest canopy, where the night creatures make their nests, where the berries are safe to eat. Humans rarely venture here. My misfortune was coming across one. And now here I lie, mortally wounded, gashed by an axe in my chest and side, left here to die after the girl and the woodsman rescued the old woman from the closet and ran away, abandoned this house to serve as my crypt. They even took the basket of cakes. The pain is intense. I am dizzy. My breaths are labored. And still I feel the hunger in my belly, the hunger that made me stop the girl in the woods. First, because of the scent of the cake she carried. Then, the sight of her bright red cloak. Finally, as she neared my hiding place in the thick brush, the aroma of her flesh was too much for me to bear. Aside from a few stray hares and squirrels, I hadn't eaten much for weeks. The forest, once teeming with prey, has been overhunted. I myself narrowly escaped bullets and arrows numerous times. Yet I, like the hunters themselves, became greedy. When I approached her, my plan was simple. I would consume her whole and then eat the cakes as dessert. But I didn't want her screams to attract hunters and others, so I decided I would approach gently, calmly, and speak to her in a friendly manner. With her guard down, I would then lunge at her, clasp my jaws around her neck, feel the juice spurt into my mouth where my sharp teeth punctured her veins. Then I would swallow her small body, using my throat muscles to guide her nutritious organs and tissues down into my empty stomach. Yes, that was my initial plan. The young girl startled me, though, by willingly engaging me in conversation. She told me that she was on the way to her grandmother's house, that the cakes were intended for the old woman. Incredibly, the innocent waif even told me where the house was located. That should have been the end of it. But as I said, I got greedy. Why eat one girl and a few cakes when I could have the girl and a woman and the cakes as well? With such a feast, I could then go several days without worrying about when I would eat my next meal. I could even save the cakes for later. It was the double portion of protein that I desperately needed to maintain my strength to survive in this depleted forest. So I wished the girl a merry journey and raced to her grandmother's house as fast as I could. It was there that the feast would be served. To gain entry, I imitated the girl's lilting voice, and once inside, I forced the old woman into the closet, threatening to kill her if she made a sound. Of course, I could simply have eaten her then and there and been done with it, but I wanted it all, and all at the same time. My new plan, then, was to take the woman's place in her bed and fool the child when she entered. When the girl finally arrived, though, things began to unravel. I asked her to get into bed with me, which she did. But then she began asking me questions. Clearly, she was suspicious of me, and I was growing impatient with her. I could take only so much of her questioning before my hunger demanded I take action. When finally she asked why my teeth were so big, I answered her, quite honestly, in fact, and she leapt out of the bed. I tried to follow, but the claws in one of my hind paws caught on the blankets. Rather than lunge at the girl, I ended up sprawled on the floor, tangled in the woolen bed covering, trying desperately to free my foot. A nearby woodsman heard her shrieks. Just as I managed to rise again, he entered and attacked me with his axe. 2 whacks, and I fell again to the floor. At that point, the old woman cried out from the closet. The woodsman stepped over me and freed the girl's grandmother from her temporary prison. As they left, I heard the girl call me a big bad wolf. But I was only hungry and greedy, I suppose. But since when are those capital offenses? Now all that remains is my weakening body, lying in a pool of my own blood, relating this sad tale and waiting to die. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Krolak, and I am a free range collaborator who is based in Malden. I am also the co-artistic director of Monkey House, a nonprofit that connects communities to choreography, and the creator of the Dictionary of Negative Space. What you'll see on the screen next to me are some of the entries from the Dictionary of Negative Space. You'll notice that there are these empty holes where a word would normally be, and they express some of the challenges that people often feel when they're grieving or mourning someone, because we don't have language for a lot of the ideas that go along with this phase of our lives. And the Dictionary of Negative Space is an interdisciplinary lament for the words that we lack relating to grief, trauma, repair. I wanted to start today by taking a moment to explain why I thought grief and the subject of loss would be appropriate at this time when we've all been in lockdown for a year, and it's been a year of tremendous losses, both in terms of life, but in terms of our way of life. And the arts have always been a part of grief. They've always been a part of how we process death, from music that set up funerals to eulogies and art that gets made in response to death. And as we're talking about this, know that it's okay if you join in the conversation to talk about other types of loss. We certainly have had things that are losses of jobs, losses of income, losses of our freedoms, losses of our ability to see people, even just the lack of a word for what it means to imagine what it's going to be like to be able to hug someone again, or the genuine desire to be able to make contact with people again. And I think that as we talk about things tonight, we should all try and keep in mind that we're going to approach this with a spirit of openness and acceptance for each other's points of view, and try and be willing to dig into some topics that are already going to be vulnerable and a little difficult for people. So, with that in mind, the story that Jason just read digs into the idea of an anti 101, which in the Dictionary of Negative Space, you may have noticed, is a death that does not elicit our compassion or grief. The way that he approaches the wolf and the characters that he's interested in are taking and flipping that idea and looking at who we think is worthy of mourning and who we think is worthy of caring about in the aftermath of loss. And so I was wondering, Jason, as we start tonight, if we could talk a little bit about the challenges that you found in being able to approach a story from that direction. Obviously, it's something that we are somewhat familiar with within our contemporary culture, things like Wicked that have done exactly that and changed things. But for you, were there any challenges that came up in taking the characters that are supposed to be terrible and being able to show them in this different light?
On the contrary, I found it to be very fun. I didn't sort of think how the stories would end when I started them. I just thought, okay, this is just a different perspective. But again, it's like if you're if you're staying on the dark side of things and looking out, then you're not seeing. It's almost like the opposite of the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, you're consumed by this dark character who, by necessity, has to sort of justify their actions. And I think that I didn't try too hard to do that. I kind of found that the material just sort of came to me. I mean, the thing about fairy tales is that even though, as I said, even though, good people, innocent people are endangered, they never, in most cases, they never do die. Good wins out over evil. But you can look at it like, well, someone might die at the end, and does it really make no difference to us if it's the bad guy who dies? That's sort of an open question.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question on a lot of levels, because I think, as you pointed out, there's a lot that comes from having to humanize people that we think are villains. And I was thinking a lot this week as we were getting ready for this about about both what prompted me to start the Dictionary of Negative Space project and the moment that I had that was exactly like what you're talking about, because I began the project after my mom, my dad, and my brother were killed in a car accident. And about a little over a year and 4 months after the accident, I had to go to court and meet the man who killed them, the driver of the other car. And I wasn't sure how to be able to approach that or think about it or process it. And fortunately, about 3 weeks before the event, there was a theater project that was in town by a group called Global Arts Corps, and they were looking at the perspective of translators in the South African Truth and Reconciliation trials, and the perspective of people who had to stand up and in the first person say all of the horrible things that somebody else had done to be able to translate them to the multilingual group that was amassed there. And in that, they talked a lot about the power of being able to humanize people on both sides and about what they saw happening in rooms when people had to listen to each other's experiences. And so for me, when I went and met the man who killed my family members, it was extremely difficult, but was helpful because I could see that he was just a person, and a person who seemed remorseful, at least the first time that I met him, about what had happened. But I wonder sometimes about the challenges that this can present, because at the same time this week that we've been dealing with this, there's been kind of an uproar in the media about the shooting case down in Atlanta, where the police have been approaching things from the perspective of the shooter rather than talking about the losses of life that were there. And so I'm wondering, do you see any challenges in when it becomes necessary to look at it from the side of what we see as being the antagonist or see as being the perpetrator of something? Or is there always kind of a valid reason to be digging into something like that?
Well, of course, I think there is a distinction to be made between fiction and nonfiction. And in
Sure.
the case of nonfiction, when you're dealing with a crime of that magnitude, you really need to focus on the victims. And it's helpful to try to understand what prompts someone, like in the case of your family members, it was probably a person who made a mistake, and some mistakes are worse than others and have longer impacts. But it's also, I think, a case to be made for someone who just has evil ideas and evil thoughts, or just extremely negative ones, and takes them out on innocent people for reasons that we can't justify. In fiction, you can create that justification because any character that you present in a story, you want to try to make real and dig into their motivations and their backgrounds and stuff. Conversely, when I wrote my two historical novels, there were times when a character that I cared about needed to go through a crisis of some sort. Something bad had to happen to a character I cared about, and I found it very difficult to put them in that situation. I felt that I was being the villain by creating a violent situation or just a very impossible choice that they had to make. And eventually, in the case of my first book, there's this character named Alexandra who was really at a crossroads, and I really cared about her. And at some point in the writing, she told me that she could take it. And so I was able to, put her through a crisis that she eventually got to the other side of. But it was a moral, dilemma for me, because I didn't want to make that happen for her, and I had to. The story demanded it.
That's great. I'm wondering if we can bring Natalja in at this point too, because I'm wondering how some of these ideas resonate with some of the operas that you find yourself performing in, and in particular, if any of this feels like it resonates with the piece that you began the program with tonight.
So first of all, I would like to mention that I have been singing mezzo-soprano for 17 years, right? and mezzo-soprano roles are normal witches, bitches, and bridges, as we call it. So it's either a guy or a witch or a villain woman. And now, like, I'm in the process when I need to change my fox, so I need to change my voice type into soprano. And honestly, I'm a little bit disappointed because for me, always when I had to stage a role or to sing a piece, I like to sing the bad girls, you know? Because probably the reason and the answer to that is like, good people, they just live by 10 commandments, which everybody knows, right? But exactly as Jason already mentioned, right? When it comes to the bad people, you really want to understand what inside this person's brain and why he or she acted it in a certain way. So yeah, like now that's an interesting period for me because I'll probably need to also to find something nice. I mean, I'm in general a nice person, but however, as a singer, I like to sing bad girls more. So that's just my personal feedback in general as a fictional character in the opera.
Well, and I wonder too if part of it is just being able to give ourselves permission to explore that territory that, is clearly a part of human nature that we need to have some kind of understanding about, since there are so many things that are beyond kind of our ability as humans to make sense of, and the way that we want to make sense of things, that like to get to dig into a character that's doing something evil or cruel allows us to kind of understand better about when those moments happen in our own life and when we are faced with things. I mean, I was really astounded that the show that Global Arts did had this direct real world implication for me. I remember walking out and being like, this is why I love theater. I forget sometimes that it isn't just about a luxury item that we go and see, but it actually is helpful at different times in our lives to be able to hear a piece of music or to read a book or to go see a show and to really feel that sense of I'm not alone and that there's a connection there that kind of comes out of that. And I think as artists, we get to kind of play with that a lot.
Right.
I'm wondering, how do you find the energy in yourselves, particularly this year, to be building art and creating things when you're navigating your own grief, your own losses? How do you reconcile that challenge of both being kind of in a mental fog that we all experience with grief and also being able to push that sense of creativity in yourself? Does it help?
Well, I can tell you that at the time that I began my first novel, my marriage was breaking up, but I was still living in the house. But I had a lot of time on my hands because no one in the house wanted to spend time with me. And I could have done any number of things. I could have drank a lot. I could have, stayed out. I could have gone out. I could have watched a whole lot of TV. I decided I was going to write. And it was both cathartic, but also very empowering that I was doing something very constructive. I wasn't writing about my situation. I was in, 17th century England. And, but it was just a great way to channel all the horrible, feelings I was feeling into something that was art, or hopefully art. And so when the pandemic, struck, I was still working, but I was working from home. And, you realize there's a lot of hours in the day when you're not going out to clubs or restaurants and hanging out with friends and stuff like that. And so I was sort of looking for a project. And when the fairy tale prompt came up, I said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And for me, it was just if I hadn't done that, and if I hadn't written a book, my first book, when my marriage was falling apart, I would have just felt like I'd wasted, an opportunity to be creative. And there's no better time to be creative than when you are faced with challenges.
What about you, Natalja? I'm sure that it's been a challenging year for you because so much of your art is done in public spaces, and simply the act of singing has been something that's been challenging because of the way that disperses the air from our lungs. Have you been getting to perform much in the last year?
So the first challenge I would like to mention is taking care of my neighbors. I mean, actually, that's a huge challenge nowadays because before all this thing happened, I never rehearsed at home. because for me, you know, like home is home. So home is for relaxation, home is for meditation, home is for, you know, all your stuff, but not singing, definitely. And after a year, I finally learned that it's okay to sing, just be moderate with that. So what this time made me realize in general that like you need to use your time smartly. And what I'm saying, right? I mean, I could torture my neighbors for 3, 4 hours learning one piece, right? But that's how I learned myself to work at the things which are I'm not so good at, right? Because I know, you know, oh, you know, here's my hour, and I need to concentrate maximum. I need to do my best in during this period. So that was like a huge, how to say, it's life lesson. And the second thing which I like to mention, and it was a good saying which I heard back in my home country. So people are like cockroaches, you know. So we can get used to any sort of circumstances, and it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. But for me, you know, yes, it was challenging for the first while, but after a certain while, I understood, you know, I actually love it. I'm more productive than I used to be before this thing happened. So I don't know whether it's my in general mindset to find always positive things in any life situation, or it's just a habit I learned. But it's challenging, but still I can't say I totally hate it or I'm not comfortable with that. Of course, I do miss the stage. That's definitely because I miss the energy of the people. When you do online performances, the only thing which is really missing is the energy. And that's the major factor why we sing, because we
Mm-hmm.
like to receive the feedback from the audience, right? And online, it's not that possible as it would be live. But yeah, I mean, I just use this time to learn new materials and new songs. Like as I already mentioned, I'm now changing my fach. That's another challenge because I need to completely change the whole repertoire I'm singing currently. So I'm not bored, and I'm just thankful the life for this opportunity to look at what I'm doing from another angle.
And is it difficult to be able to give up the identity that you've had within the opera, like as a mezzo soprano and becoming a soprano? Is that a difficult change for you, or is that something that most opera singers expect during the course of their career and it just is kind of a natural transition?
So the first of all, normally it goes vice versa. So normally a soprano becomes a mezzo because suddenly the high range disappears. For me, I remember when I used to sing mezzo, and now I still sing mezzo. The first piece I was singing was actually a mezzo piece. It took me a huge while to master the music. So it took me a great while to understand where it feels in the body, how to produce the sound in a better way. But with soprano pieces, it's unbelievable. But I just take the piece and I sing, and I don't think about what's going on in my throat, what's going on in the body. You just think about the music, right? And for me, this whole situation when I can just enjoy what I'm doing without thinking what is going on in my throat, that's a real blessing because
Mm.
I was struggling, as I already mentioned, for 17 years, and not struggling. Sometimes, you know, we just want to make the best out of what we are having nowadays. And now when you take a new piece and, you know, it just clicks in, is just amazing. That's probably one of the positive sides of this transfer. However, in terms of acting and in terms of the switch of the roles, that will be a new challenge. And so far, I haven't faced it. I haven't sung any soprano roles so far. But when it happens, that will probably be something new. And I'm always up for new. And looks like that's just another challenge I will need to eventually overcome.
So one of the other questions that just came up is saying that, you know, we tend to use the arts as a way to abstractly deal with real life situations. And they're curious about the distinction that was made about the difference between the reality and the fiction of villainy, and the idea of how within the arts we can go back and forth um, between those, and what kind of responsibility we have as artists in terms of how we present those characters. I know, Jason, you touched a little bit on that, talking about the struggle with those characters when you have to do things to them that are bad or feel uncomfortable. But I'm curious about how that feels for other people in terms of like where our explorations go from being kind of an abstract idea of something, and then when we put it out in the world, what happens with that, you know?
I think for the sake of my book on fairy tales, I mean that affords me quite a wide berth. You know, I'm dealing with talking wolves, and there's magic, and there's witches, and there's all kinds of fantastical things. one of the fun things about the world of fairy tales is that the characters in them are never surprised that they come upon someone with magical powers or a fairy godmother just appears. They just sort of take that as part of their world. And so, like, just the way in science fiction, you can create a world that doesn't really adhere to the rules that we have here. Fairy tales can take us there as well. Clearly there's so much violence and death in media today, whether it's, a documentary or the news or any of the many shows that we're all spending way too much time watching throughout this pandemic and binging. I mean, there's just more and more creative ways of killing people. And the one thing that strikes me is that, even though there may be a lot of blood, it's all it's fairly clean. You don't hear a lot of like moaning and crying and screaming in pain. You get shot and you fall down, and then you go on to the next one. So I think in some ways violence is treated fairly cheaply, and definitely voyeuristically, in a way that's not real. And I don't want to go to a dark place, but I remember reading about the Sandy Hook shootings,
Mm-hmm.
and and there was medical professionals who were saying, what these kinds of assault weapons do to a body.
Yep.
And you don't get that. A splatter of blood on your chest in a movie is not the same as being horribly ripped apart. And these, of course, were kids, and it was like very difficult for me to even think about that. But if you tried to do that realistically on TV, they wouldn't air it. It's too horrible.
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point too, that one of the things that often I notice because of my work is when people say things like, I don't know the words, just talk about this, or like, I don't know how to be able to discuss this. And I think that there is this problem of where imagination is a really great thing for us to be able to imagine things and to take the time to actually put ourselves in the shoes of like a parent of one of those kids from Sandy Hook and have to really look at like, what is that whole process like? And also the challenge of like not wanting to take those images that are the images that are so horrible that, people, once they see them, are like, I never want to see something like that again. And not broadcast them, both for not sharing them with people, but for inspiring people on the other side. There's been such an interesting conversation around even how we cover these things in the news, that, they're making a real point these days of trying to downplay the role of a shooter by not naming them oftentimes, or not like listing the body counts, things like that apparently they're finding are ways to be able to stop ideation around that. And so like there's this place where imagination is both really helpful and at the other side can be really challenging. I wonder, Natalja, for you, when you're creating characters on the stage that are evil or wicked and you're working to be able to bring them to life, do you feel a sense of responsibility for how people like walk out and think about them or understand those roles?
Oh yes, I definitely do, and I will even tell more. I actually struggle not to live the life of this character.
Mm,
And for example, when I play the role of the medium, I'll tell you honestly, and Jim knows, I started having visions myself.
wow.
And that's like the verge, and that's the artistical verge. And I actually read many actors are not complaining, they're sharing this opinion. So that's a real artistry, just to be able to turn off these emotions when you're at home. So when you're on stage, of course, you give the maximum out. Of
Hmm.
course, you feel responsible because you want to give the maximum out, because you want the audience to fall, either hate your character or fall in love with your character, as depending on who you are playing, right? But the artistry is being able to switch between the real life and what's going on stage, right? So even, and based on what I have heard from colleagues, it's sometimes becomes a huge challenge when you are playing hard role. Yeah, so for example, Sor Angelica, the piece I will be singing in the end when she loses her child. And that's a huge challenge not to fall too deep emotionally when you are out of the stage, because you have responsibility, you want to make the best out of that. That's why you are thinking always before you start, after you start. So the artistry is like really putting a stop to that on a certain moment, and I'm still in process of figuring out how it works. And I think it's any actor's problem in general in life to be able to have this click and have the switch if you are really worried about your audiences and them understanding your character.
Well, I think you make a really great point about the research that goes into things, and that challenge of getting too deep into that. This is a great transition actually into the question that's up on the screen. Jason, how do you find the inspiration for your novels? And I'm curious, kind of along those lines, what kind of research do you engage in for your novels?
Yeah, great question, because both my novels were inspired by songs. The first one, which is based on a 17th century English folk ballad, that ballad is commonly known today as Mattie Groves. And sort of the most classic rendition of that, done in recent times, was done by an English folk rock group called Fairport Convention in 1969. And it's sort of a classic case of adultery and murder between the classes. And I always loved the song, and when I had the opportunity to write and chose that to base the work on, I had it in my mind, well, I'm just going to play the song and write the book, and it's a long song. It's 8 minutes, but after 8 minutes, I had about 16 words. So I knew that wasn't going to last. But there also were sort of, as it would be typical in an Old English ballad, there's almost like puzzles in there that you have to figure out. And it opens a holiday, the first one of the year. Lord Darnell went to mass, the gospel gospel for to hear. And so the first thing you need to figure out when you're writing a novel is where does it take place? When does it take place? And so the holiday, the first one of the year, and they're going to church, I presumed that it was Easter. So that started my research there. What are some of the Easter time traditions in 17th century England? And fortunately, the liner notes on the album provided some clues, because there was this Easter time tradition known as pace egging from the northwest part of England. And so I looked on a map and I said, okay, this is going to take place in Lancashire County. And it sort of snowballed from there. And my second novel was inspired by a song by the jazz singer Cassandra Wilson. She has a song called Solomon Sang. And the line in the song that got me was, when he lay down with Makeda, Solomon sang. And from the other lyrics, I could tell she was singing about King Solomon, but I'd never heard Makeda mentioned in Sunday school. And when I Googled that, I found out it was the Ethiopian name for the Queen of Sheba, and that the Ethiopian tradition is very different from what you read in the Bible, in that in the Bible, the Queen of Sheba hears about King Solomon's wisdom, is curious, comes to visit, asks some questions, and leaves with some parting gifts. In the Ethiopian tradition, she stays 6 months and goes back to Ethiopia pregnant. So I said, well, that's what I want to focus on. But yeah, for me, music is very inspirational and evocative. And though I don't really have a music prompt for the fairy tale book, it's something that I continue to think about. What songs or pieces of music do I know that I could create, a story around and launch from there.
And then we've got another question of how much research/development do you do looking into the perspective of the characters that aren't the one that you're playing, or the character of the story that you're writing? And I'm actually curious about that, Natalja, especially from the perspective of opera, how much research do you do for each show? And is it just on your character? Is it the entire show? How does that work for you?
So for me personally, I'll tell you honestly, I dive into very deep. And even with the medium, as I already mentioned, we actually hired a real medium to coach
Mm,
me what she does. Because
mm,
I actually never faced them in my life. I mean, yeah, there were some people who do tarot cards, which, you know, it was a fashionable moment when, fashionable period in my home country when everybody fell for that. But for me to understand what's really in the medium head, I had to speak with somebody who is a medium or who claims himself herself as a medium. And we actually found this person, and we had, I think, 3 sessions with her. If I don't, yeah, I think it were 3 sessions, and she helped me a lot. So she actually described me how she feels, what she experiences, and
mm,
why she chose this path, and that was super helpful for me to understand the whole idea of this character. And that's a huge challenge with the bad characters, right? Because you really
mhm.
need to dive into the negative side of that. And that's a big question, how deep you want to dive into, and how to really stay with a bright mind, you know, when you understand the real basis why all of the circumstances were happening. And that's actually also a challenge nowadays because some of the shows are produced as they are in modern time, right?
Mhm.
And often you really need to dig into the historical aspect, why this opera was composed, what composer was thinking when he was writing that, in order to understand and in order to get this information. Because when you just look at that from the modern perspective, of course, there are things which never change, right? But when you know also the historical side of that, it's just more helpful for you to look at that from another angle. So my personal experience, I always dive into. I read the novel. I try to find even a person of similar, how I explained already with the medium. So even for example, if I have to play a guy, yeah, I start watching guys how they make gestures, how they walk, how they talk, and why they act in a certain way or why they do in a certain way. Because I can't play a guy just because I'm Natalia and I'm a guy. So I really want to understand what's going on in the head. And with that, bad character is often not very pleasant. Let's be, I want to be true about that.
That's really it's fascinating. I love hearing about how other people research things. As I've worked on the Dictionary of Negative Space, I first began by going through like all of the things that we're experiencing in my own life, and then began doing lengthy phone calls to people that had had different types of losses in their life, and interviewing them and finding out more, and then researching places where things have happened, and being able to really meet with people who have other fields. One of the projects I've been working on this year with the dictionary has involved looking at things from the side of people who work in cemeteries who have had an incredible, insanely difficult task ahead of them over the last year. They've had the same kind of PPE problems that the medical field has, but because, again, of the kind of significant taboos we have around death and loss, and the images that we have of undertakers in literature and in films and in kind of our collective cultural memory makes them all into kind of these morbid, terrible people. We don't sympathize with the role that they've been given over the last year of having to deal with so much more loss than before. Um, and I think that it's fantastic to be able to see the way that both of you guys are kind of both prepping for the roles that you play within things, as well as what you're creating from that. As we get to wrapping up, I'm curious about one thing. Both of you have mentioned music a great deal, and it has gotten me thinking about. I went to see Bill T. Jones in the early 2000s, and he was giving a talk, and he began talking about the song you sing to yourself when the deal gets so bad. And it was a thing that I remember, like, kind of making note of, because I thought at the time, like, I don't know what song that is. I don't have a song that's like that. But I definitely have books that I go to when things get really bad that I will go and like read again and again. And one of them is The Little Prince. And so I'm just curious for the two of you, is there a song that you sing to yourself when the deal gets so bad? Are there pieces of music or pieces of literature or paintings that you turn to at times when you're dealing with a loss of some kind?
I think that there's sort of two approaches to this. Um, you know, if you're feeling sad, you can either, or feeling lost, you can either want to soak in it or you want to like remove yourself from it, take your mind off it. I'm the kind of person who likes to soak in it. I like to marinate in my sorrow. If I'm angry, if I'm sad, then I'm looking for angry and sad songs to listen to. And during a particularly bad breakup many, many years ago, I actually auditioned songs. I tried to think of sad songs that I knew and played them to see which one really, hit me. And I found it. It was called "It Makes No Difference" by the band, and I must have played it 20 times a day for weeks. And when I finally got sick of it, that's when I knew I was better.
What about you, Natalja?
For me, it's very interesting because I love to perform sad songs more.
Mm.
But when it comes to listening to the music, yeah, I don't really surround myself with sad songs. So when it comes to listening to music, I honestly, I, for example, listen to trance. So it may sound very, very strange for an opera singer, but maybe because I dive into so much as an artist, right? When performing, for me, I just need something easy and something not to think about that too much. So, and even when it comes to grief or when I'm depressed, I don't even want to listen to anything. But I think it's just a matter of, I was, when you were working in the industry for so long, right? For you, sometimes you just need the silence to meditate. So for me, sometimes I just need complete silence for, for having the conversation with myself. I just don't want any distractions. So, but I think it's just the way how we try to survive. And silence is also music is also silences.
Sure, sure. Well, this is wonderful. I want to take a second and just thank Urban Media Arts for having all of us together for this inaugural episode of Arts and Minds, and to thank all of you who have come out for Arts and Mind in the midst of winter, loss of life, and grief. If you are interested in helping out with a future episode, or want to submit a proposal of your own to become a featured artist, or to have a group that you're a part of be featured on it, please reach out to Amanda H at urbanmediaarts.org and let her know. They are totally exciting people to work with, and I cannot thank them enough for having started this. And thank you both to Natalja and to Jason for being a part of this first episode and this little experiment that we've all been on. I
Thanks for
believe
guiding
that
us.
we are
Thank you very much.
I believe that we are going to go out with one last song from Natalja. So thank you all very much, and please keep the chat going.
It's the video already. Scendere giù pel firmamento ed aleggiare intorno me dissento sei qui mi baci e m'accarezzi. Dimmi quando in ciel potrò vederti, quando potrò baciarti, o dolce fine d'ogni mio dolore. Quando in cielo con te potrò salire, quando potrò morire, quando potrò morire.